And now on the line is Senator Pauline O'Reilly from the Green Party. Pauline, welcome back to Nair FM.
Thank you, Darren.
Pauline, I got in touch with you today for this interview to mainly find out what you, your party, and the government and the EU think, in your view, about the recently announced UN High Seas Treaty. For the benefit of anyone listening, Pauline, who doesn't know anything about the recent UN High Seas Treaty, can you tell them first of all what it is, and then tell them how big or historic of an agreement it is?
So it's an agreement between nations on how they treat the oceans that are outside of any country's jurisdiction. So we all have some amount of seas that are part of our country. In Ireland, the seas are about 7 times the size of the land, and we have jurisdiction over that, so we can do things like have marine protected areas and so on. But actually 2/3 of the ocean are outside of any country's jurisdiction. So in a way, they've kind of been lawless, and that's really had a really bad impact on nature, marine nature. And so this treaty is really about putting some shape on how it'll be treated and having an agreement around that from nations.
And I was reading up on the treaty, and am I right in saying that it has not actually come into force yet?
Yeah, I mean, and even when it does come into force, there are lots of elements of it that are kind of ongoing. So they'll require kind of ongoing negotiation. But even coming to the agreement itself is historic, as you say, because one of the big parts of it is that there will be marine protected areas, and then there will be, environmental assessments before things are done, like drilling. So a couple of fears, I suppose, that people have had is that rich countries or rich companies are coming in and drilling for, maybe that oil or gas or whatever it is in the high seas, and there haven't been any environmental assessments. And then the other big one is the pharmaceutical industry has been using some of the biology there to test, or for things like stem cell research, and getting huge benefit from it, where actually countries that don't have as much money aren't getting that kind of benefit. So it's putting a shape on all of that, an agreement on all of that there has to be agreement before that can be done. And there has to be some benefit back to poorer countries as well from the research, so that there's research sharing.
I didn't actually know that about pharmaceutical companies. A big thing I'm interested in, I'm not an expert on the area, but it's the issue of pollution. That's a huge issue, isn't it?
It's a massive issue, and I know we've spoken about it before. So, I mean, going back a long time, people have been aware of microplastics, microbeads in the sea, but there's all kinds of other things, like the huge amounts of dumping happening in the high seas, and also things like oil spills, and whose responsibility is it to clean that up. So that's what this high seas agreement is about as well, is some collective responsibility. But, it's been negotiated over 3 years, over, 6, I think, 2-week periods. And it's not been easy to come to some of those agreements because, there are some nations that want to take any responsibility. So even the last session was, I think, nearly 40 hours long, continuous negotiations to even get to where it got to. And even though it is historic, as I say, there is still ongoing work that's needed, particularly in some of those areas around pollution and people taking responsibility.
And what ministers can you tell me from the Irish government that took part in negotiations?
I know Malcolm Noonan was involved. I'm not entirely sure what other ministers.
Okay.
But it's, a lot of it's been done by experts and by officials and things, as opposed to ministers, because a lot of it is really technical. So Malcolm Noonan, as you know, would be Minister for Heritage and Biodiversity. So that would be under the Department of Housing and Local Government. But when it comes to the marine environment in general, the other thing to be made aware of is that Ireland has made huge advances itself. We had in the programme for government that we'd have 30% of our seas would be marine protected areas, and by next summer we will have reached the 10% target. So by 2030, then we'll be much closer to protecting our environment. And the other thing, of course, is that having marine protected areas, both in terms of Ireland's seas, but also in terms of the high seas, it doesn't mean that it stops fishing. It doesn't mean that it stops offshore wind development. Although you wouldn't have offshore wind development necessarily in the high seas. It just means that you have proper environmental assessments, that you're mapping out, well, we can do these activities in this area, we can't do that activity. And actually, having travelled myself to Scotland to see some of the offshore developments there, actually you can have offshore wind and it actually increases biodiversity because it's creating space for nature to develop.
Okay, I know we're talking about the seas, but can you tell me if the government and your party, which are in government, are any closer to ending the pollution in Irish rivers and around the Irish coast? Because that's a huge issue, isn't it, as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I still think there's a huge amount of work to do there, and part of it is because a lot of it is about enforcement of rules that already exist. And so we need to do a couple of things, and one of those things is, as you say, ending pollution. But the other one is about putting into place things that mean that there isn't the pollution in the first place. So we will have this year a huge rollout of bottle return scheme, because that's one of the major things that creates the pollution is plastic bottles. And so this bottle return scheme will be where you can get money back for bottles, and so that people won't be just dumping them, but they'll actually look at them as valuable. And there's a big rollout as well of ending single-use cups for coffee and coffee and tea. So again, there'll be a levy placed on cups, and then an awful lot of places will be rolling out where they will only allow reusable cups. And so from that point of view, all of that I think is the key part that we can do. And we also have a piece of legislation that will allow local authorities to put up CCTV cameras. And again, that piece of legislation, it has gone through. So that will mean in black spots where people keep dumping, CCTV can be put up, and that will ensure that people can be prosecuted for dumping. So, I mean, the EPA reports do show that town centres are improving, but I still think that there's a lot of work to be done, particularly around waterways, inland waterways, and some of that is from agriculture as well, from nitrates and from fertilizer, and particularly from some forms of agriculture, particularly dairy, and so that I think needs to be curtailed.
Yeah, I did an interview last year with Clean Coasts, and they told me, and it's something that only registered with me in the last year or two after I read an article about it, but the biggest cause of around the world of pollution, like cigarette butts. And a lot of people, that doesn't even, like, a lot of people don't even know that, like, but that's a huge issue, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and we have brought in something where cigarette companies will be forced to pay for that, for the pollution caused.
That in our last interview. I just come back.
We did, yeah.
But the biggest I know we talked about plastic and mentioned cigarette butts, but like the biggest, I think, cause of pollution in Irish rivers is sewage, isn't it?
Yeah, sewage is a big difficulty, and one of the challenges that Ireland has is that there's been pretty poor plumbing, and there's a lot of facilities that are not up to scratch in terms of cleaning water, and so particularly in some parts of my own area in the west of Ireland, we do have treatment centres that are over capacity. And again, some parts of Leinster, that's very much a problem as well, where literally raw sewage has been going into rivers. Some of that's been cleaned up, but there's still a lot of work to do. And, you know, a lot of it is proper treatment plants and some of the plumbing, but also really targeting people and taking people to court. So yeah, it is a big issue.
I know you live in Galway. I've heard about the issue in Spiddal. Like, it's unbelievable. Like, I think for the 21st century, and for a nation as rich as Ireland, that we have sewage going into the sea. Like, I find it incredible. Like, you know, but it's gonna probably cost billions of euros to fix the whole water system, will it?
Yeah, I mean, it does cost a lot of money, but quite apart from the money, you know, it's all of the work that needs to be done. Like, that's not something that happens overnight, as we keep saying about things, but it is true. So, I mean, there are new sewage treatment plants going in, but again, they've got to go through planning, and all of that, and so I would certainly see that we'll have some level of improvement, but there's still a long way to go, to be honest.
Okay, so the situation is not going to be sorted out in the next few years now. It'll take longer, will it?
Well, I would hope it would be the next few years, all right. Yeah, I would. But as I say, you know, it's not one thing. You know, it's not just sewage. It's even when there are treatment plants, you know, animal manure going into our waterways, the fertilizers. It's all of that. So there's loads of different elements to it that have to be part of the solution. And we've also had this really complicated system in Ireland where different organisations are in charge of different things when it comes to water in particular, that I certainly know from my own experience trying to sort out a problem can be quite challenging, because you know, whether it's the local authority in charge, whether it's Waterways Ireland, whoever it is, people pass the buck a little bit, or the EPA.
Yeah, I see that Dunleer or Rathdown County Council have a campaign now about cigarette pollution. I understand the Dublin City Council had the same campaign a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So it's great on that issue. Okay, Pauline, to come towards the end of our interview, I know we have COPs, the UN COPs, short for Conference of the Parties, at UN level on climate change and biodiversity. I think these kind of COPs, because they're so big, are great at getting publicity in the media and for the different issues like climate change and biodiversity. But I understand that we are assumingly going to have a COP in future about the implementation of the UN High Seas Treaty. I think this is great news in terms of kind of media coverage. Do you?
Yeah, and actually, you know, the High Seas Treaty did get a good bit of media coverage, and I think people really care about water, and the fact that 2/3 of the ocean is not under any one country makes this really, really important to have, as you say, a conference of the parties, because it brings everybody together, and it's not going to be something that overnight fixes everything. It has to be ongoing, and part of what the treaty has done is to set up committees of experts, and therefore there needs to be ongoing work. So I think it's very, very welcome. And as you say, there was a lot of publicity around COP, and depending where it is, and it travels around, you know, when it's in a Western country, it brings it to light in Western countries. When it's in a part of the global South, then it brings attention there from the media. So I think that works really well.